Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, including how the GOP has restructured its approach to voting laws, how the progressives in the left coalition may actually be pushing back on some of the more woke elements, and then our final article talking about Doug Emhoff's theory of why Donald Trump will not debate Kamala Harris. And of course, we will end today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump into our daily debate. So, do you think that the Republican approach to voter fraud has actually netted them more voters? I would say probably not, especially when it comes with claims that we need to actually, what's the word I'm looking for? Crack down on certain practices that have been relatively normal within the United States for the last 10 years. I would say that it actually negatively impacts their image, but maybe you don't agree. Maybe you're a person who genuinely understands where they're coming from, and you think that it actually really strengthens their argument for trying to be the party that comes out on top. Tell me what you think. Throw it down in the comments section, because our first article that comes from the Hill talks all about this. The headline reads, Trump's GOP moves to dramatically revamp election rules. And this is a pretty thick article, and I'm going to add my commentary in every once in a while, but I do just want to read some excerpts from it because they show a different perspective of the Republican retooling of the election system that if you're a person who's a Republican, you may not have heard, and if you're a person who's liberal, you may not have heard it done so, how should I say, even-handedly. The Hill is not the most even-handed paper / publication out there, but they at least try to give some good faith to this side of the argument. And I think that if you're a liberal who hasn't heard this side of it before, maybe stick around. Like I said, if you're a Republican, you probably have not heard this before, unless you guys are outside your ecosystems and you're learning a whole bunch of different information from a whole bunch of different places. But let's jump into what they're actually saying. Quote, a review of the voting landscape by the Hill shows the breadth of effort carried out at the state and local level, where GOP officials have adopted a number of measures to increase partisan control of elections and secure greater opportunities to audit results and hinder certification. They've also launched a series of lawsuits or other challenges seeking to cull voter rolls, sparking fears that bids to remove tens of thousands from the list will inevitably remove qualified voters. And this is definitely one of the fears. This is always one of the fears. When you have a conversation about making sure that the voter rolls are up to date, that you have to disqualify a certain amount of voters, that there are possibly old people voting, and I say old people who are possibly passed away, whether it be people who are of different descents or from other locations, whether it be the Latin American population who has come into the United States, there's always arguments that these people could potentially vote if they're able to get an ID. One of the most obvious examples that gets thrown around by people on the right all the time is California, and technically that doesn't apply to federal elections. It's supposed to be for local elections and school board elections, but in DC, technically all you have to show in order to vote is to have a driver's license, and you don't necessarily have to be born in the United States in order to get a driver's license in DC. I've done a detailed breakdown on that before. You can go back to that episode. It was a whole research episode where it was basically just on one topic. It didn't get much traction, mainly because it's talking about something that's not necessarily popular to talk about, but we did go into the breakdown between two areas that are considered a little bit more Democrat, New Mexico versus DC, and how there are very different approaches to actually guaranteeing that the people on these voter rolls are actually legitimate citizens, but also they're not people who have passed away. They're not illegal or fraudulent sort of attempts in order to get more votes for one candidate or another. But the GOP has taken this to an extreme. And when they are filing all these lawsuits and they are filing all of these different motions all across the nation in order to purge people, you do run into the possibility that maybe there's Joe Schmo down the road who hasn't voted in the last 8 years, the last 2 presidential elections, and that could be, or even the local elections, and the justification for removing him is, well, obviously he's not alive, or obviously we just need to make a blanket statement, you haven't voted in 8 years, so we're going to remove you from the voter rolls because you're obviously not participating, or something happened, and we don't want somebody who is I would say they have bad intent, we do not want the people to possibly have an opportunity to take advantage of those people that are not necessarily voting but are still registered to vote. But you end up hitting those people like Joe Schmo who do actually want to vote in this time, and you actually take them off the voter roll. They don't realize that they're not registered to vote, and it might be too late for them to get their say. Then again, the argument could be, and I think it's actually a pretty straightforward argument and at least logically consistent, that you should be responsible enough to check on your voter registration. If you have not checked on your voter registration, obviously you don't care enough about the elections in order to vote. And maybe you've changed addresses since then, which means you would have to change it anyway because you should be voting in a different precinct. So all these sort of arguments obviously layer in, but that doesn't mean, all of those things may be true, but that doesn't mean that we should have this heavy-handed approach where we just call everybody from the voter rolls every few years. I mean, at that rate, the argument could be that, well, you have to re-register to vote every single time you're going into an election. And that's a lot to ask a normal person who doesn't care about politics as much as you or me. I mean, if you're listening to this podcast specifically, if you've even made it this far, you care about politics to some degree. You care about it enough to listen to some random person's ranting on the internet, which means you probably are the person to go out there and actually re-register every single time there's an election. Well, what about your neighbors? What about the guy that's 5 blocks down the road? What about the guy in your county who is running a farm? They don't necessarily have the time to spend or even the energy to think about these sort of things, going and making sure that they are re-registered. So these heavy-handed moves are not actually beneficial to some United States citizens, and you have to take that into consideration. You have to make sure those arguments are heard. Now, you could still, once again, make an argument about ensuring that these are fair elections, and that should outweigh concerns about whether or not people are able to vote more easily. Then again, I think that argument is weak, but there is a logical line there, which is if you can't even trust the election to be fair, why does voting matter? So don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to be ultra dismissive, but there are multiple sides to this, and I don't necessarily think all arguments are just fatally wrong. I think there's some truth to a few of them, and they're just wrong arguments that we won't necessarily get to here today. But let's go into this next section from the article. Quote, Democrats and Republicans have squared off for decades over finding a balance between election security and access to the ballot, what we had literally just discussed a second ago. Quote, crafting policies that make it simple to vote but guard the system against abuse. But the landscape has grown more complicated since Trump's 2020 election loss. Though study after study has contradicted Republican assertions that widespread fraud plagues U.S. elections, Trump has made claims of election malfeasance a central tenet of his campaign. Now, we need to actually go into multiple layers of what they're saying here. Is widespread election fraud actually required in order to overturn the decision or change the decision in an election? No, because of the way that our system operates with the Electoral College and the way that it operates with, how should I say, moneyed interest in politics that have certain demographics and groups that they want to cater to. There are swing states that are crucial to winning an election. So therefore, if you know that certain states are going to be locked in, you don't have to cater to those. You don't have to spend money on those states as much, but you have to spend more money in swing states. And you have certain demographics and populations you have to appeal to while also trying to capture their electoral votes. Then, in theory, it takes less to, quote-unquote, rig an election than it would if it was a completely Democratic vote and it's just the popular vote, because then you have to have a widespread operation to change the votes everywhere versus having to do it in specific states and just change possibly even specific counties that could change the result of the election. Now, does that mean that Donald Trump is right, that he won the 2020 election? I don't believe so. I have not seen enough, even like 2,000 Mules, which was interesting movie to say the least, but I don't think that there is enough evidence there to claim readily that he won the 2020 election outright based on the tally of the votes. Now, could you make an argument about interference before the election, whether it be the Hunter Biden and FBI, I take that back, not just FBI, the intelligence agency letter that was signed by all these intelligence agency officials claiming that the Hunter Biden laptop was disinformation, and then yet we find out years later that all of it was true, that Hunter Biden's actually been prosecuted on certain things that weren't necessarily mentioned directly in the computer, but were alluded to as tax evasion charges, all these sort of things. So you could make an argument that that was definitely weighing or changing the outcome of the election one way or another. I think that I'm going to be real. I think that's pretty common knowledge, and it's pretty much accepted that had a big enough effect, just like Comey coming out before Hillary Clinton was presumed to win the 2016 election, possibly changed the tide ever so slightly in Donald Trump's favor. Now, if you don't necessarily believe that, that's fair enough. If you are a person who would have voted for Joe Biden, just no matter what the Hunter Biden laptop said, then of course you're not going to believe that the Hunter Biden laptop actually changed anything, and that is fair enough. And then you can outright fully dismiss Donald Trump's claims. But whether or not you believe it, and I think there's a good argument too, but even then, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter. You don't have to take my word on it, because the point here is that there are other people who genuinely believe Donald Trump's claims that he won the election, not just by the quote-unquote manipulation of social media. And there are other people who believe that he would have won the election without the social media influence, and also the last-minute rule changes due to mail-in ballots, especially in Pennsylvania. So there are people who are not you, and if you are one of those people who believes it, stick with me. I'm just trying to talk to the people that maybe disagree with you. There are people out there, and I just mentioned that there could be some of them listening that do genuinely believe it, and they're taking the onus onto themselves as they continue to improve our election system from their point of view, to strengthen it, to make sure that voter fraud is not necessarily possible. And a lot of people in the Republican Party have imbibed this message and are doing all they can to make sure this election, quote unquote, is not stolen. So what does that look like on the ground? What have these changes actually brought? Quote, if and when Donald Trump loses, he always tries to question the authenticity and reliability of the election results in order to block certification. So there's not much mystery in what they will do. Rep. Jamie Raskin, who previously served on the committee investigating the January 6, 2021 riot at the Capitol. We don't know exactly where they will do it and how they will do it, but that's their basic plan. So, and that's it's the end of the quote. That's what Raskin is saying. But yet there is actually a little bit of a section in this article, it's a bit longer, that there actually is a plan that they're going through. Quote, in Georgia, anyone can challenge a name on the state's voter rolls if they have the person's birthday, driver's license, and last four digits of their social security number. That exact information, however, was briefly auto-populated in the portal, so this is their easy registration portal, just as it was rolled out, heightening concerns that the tool could be easily abused. In recent years, nearly 100,000 Georgians have had their voter registrations challenged, something ProPublica found was largely the result of just 6 right-wing activists. So what they're saying is that there are people actually putting in the work to try to get some of these people off of the voter rolls. Over 100,000 people from Georgia. I mean, that's not a small number. And then there are actually more activities going on this year. Quote, just a fraction of the challenge have succeeded in removals. 2,350 names were cut from the voter rolls, the outlet found, but another 8,700 were placed in an intermediate status, meaning they could be forced to vote on a provisional ballot. So they're trying to take these different measures or these different actions to ensure that these people do not just fraudulently vote. And whether or not you agree that they would be fraudulently voting, that they have fraudulently voted, goodness gracious, that doesn't change the fact that the activists are out there doing and they're actively pursuing this sort of thing. And this is not just something that's done in Georgia. This is something that is believed by a large chunk of the Republican base and is being acted out in other places. So if you're a person who has not voted in a while, if you're a person who has changed addresses recently and there's a little bit of extra information out there, maybe you've been buying something on Amazon and there's a information source that has your address as somewhere else, make sure you are checking your voter registration because you could have been wiped off some of the rolls. It's rare, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So get out there and do it, because whether or not you agree with it, because even if you're a Republican who agrees with the premise, you could still be wiped off the voter rolls. You'd never know because your name, like I said, maybe you moved, maybe you misstated your information information somewhere else. Maybe you still go and vote in your old place because your family lives there, and yet you still live in a different location, so there's contrasting information out there which could cause reasonable doubt, which means they might strike you from the rolls. Then again, it doesn't necessarily work like this. They try to get rid of people that are passed away and things like this, but there are always mistakes that can happen. So be vigilant. Get out there. Go make sure that you're registered to vote in the right area. Put in the work. Put in the time. If you are a concerned voter and a concerned citizen and you really care, it comes down to you. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have to put in an extra 20 hours of doing the extra research, sending in the extra ballot. Just make sure you're registered on time, and then make sure you show up to the polling location and vote in person. Or if you want to vote by mail because you're not going to be there, get the work done. Make sure you're on top of this, because this is an important election. Is it the most important election of my lifetime? No. I would honestly say that 2016 was the most important election of my lifetime, and that's with retrospect that I can say that. At the time, I don't think I would have said that. I think at the time I probably would have said that the 2008 election was the most important election of my lifetime, and technically I was not alive for the Bush-Gore election, so that one was probably, I wasn't alive for that, but it could have been because of the Supreme Court challenge and the precedent. But besides the point, because everybody says it's the most important election of our lifetime. I don't think it is, but that doesn't mean that your voice shouldn't be heard. That doesn't mean that you can't get out there and say what you want to say, that you need to make sure that if you are interested whatsoever in politics and you are a Republican who wants to make sure that the voting system works properly, get out there and vote. Have your say. Make sure that you are, even if you don't necessarily trust all the processes in place, trust that there are activists out there trying to get it right and that your vote still matters. Get out there. This is how we actually build the trust back in the system. If you're a Democrat, make sure you check your voter registration just like a Republican should and get out there and vote. This is how you build trust back in the system, by actually operating in the system. The more people that don't actually operate in an election, that don't go out and vote in an election, the more people are going to have less faith in said system because they've never actually used it before. That was a lot to say, but I think we've gone through the main point here, which is there's been a fundamental shift in the Republican Party, and it will have effects that ripple through the Democratic and the Republican Party going forward, so we can't just ignore it. All right, with that said, let's jump into our second article that comes from Just the News. Progressive Young Turks co-host discusses why she left the Democratic Party. And for those of you who don't know, this is Ana Kasparian. She is a person who has always been more left-leaning. She is still more left-leaning. And yet there are certain movements and changes within the left wing, within the leftist part of the Democratic Party, that have disturbed her, or at least have caused her to pause when she couldn't make statements about women, when she was actually basically hated on for, actually, I'll go through and I want to actually read some of the quotes here because they are more informative than I can be just telling you the story. Quote, one turning point for her was when she was scolded by liberals after relating her experience of being sexually assaulted by a homeless man while she was out walking her dog in Los Angeles in 2022. She said she became fearful about leaving her house and was accused of being a racist, though she hadn't said anything about the man's race, end quote. And this is what happens when you have a movement that is so obsessed with ensuring that they push the message before the humanity or the empathy. So what happens in this situation? Say that Ana Kasparian was assaulted on the street. A terrible thing. We don't want anybody to have to fear leaving their house and being assaulted. But people came out and were attacking her for even mentioning this because it is a talking point. It is something that I'm even mentioning now because it's something that she talked about that can go against the narrative. The narrative for people on the left or people who are in the housing movement is that people who are unhoused, who are unfairly unhoused, it is not necessarily their fault, that homeless people don't necessarily need to be discriminated against, that they don't deserve some of the commentary and the talking points that come out of the media against them. And when you give more fuel to that fire by being a leftist who has said that she is more than willing to have more social housing projects and put more funding towards housing projects and redistributing a little bit of more tax dollars, ensuring that these people will have homes, who has previously backed some of this movement's talking points, coming out and saying, well, hey, in this case, this homeless man attacked me, that can undermine your credibility as a movement, because this is a person who said that she's aligned with it, and yet when it personally affects her, she doesn't stick to the message. And that's why you have to undermine her. That's why you have to attack her, because she is not giving up, sacrificing her own safety, her own willingness to feel safe in her house or in her neighborhood in order to make sure, or even sacrificing the, how should I say, the ability to talk about it, but that's not the right way to do it. Sacrifice her uncomfortability in not actually speaking out about this sort of thing. She is not sacrificing her own self-interest for the movement, which can be derogatory or hurtful towards the movement. So that's what happens when you have a movement that is so obsessed with staying on message that they start to not necessarily care about the individuals who are within the movement. They don't have empathy for the individuals anymore. It is no longer about the humans involved, but rather about sending the message. And then again, you could argue that their compassion is for people who don't necessarily make the money that Anna Kasparian makes, that aren't in the situation or don't have the funding from MSNBC, I believe that's, or from NBC Universal. I believe that's where they receive, the Young Turks receive some of their funding. Please correct me if I am wrong on that, but they definitely received backing from some major media corporation in the past. So you can make an argument about hierarchy and possibly class that would change the calculus, so to speak. But that doesn't mean that you can just disregard somebody's humanity. You can just disregard how somebody says that something made them feel. Now, are all emotional responses to things necessarily, how should I say, not necessarily the right responses, but are they actually coherent? Do they actually hold value? Some people emotionally react to things and it is pure emotions and it doesn't make any sense and it's not justified in order for everybody to change their habits in order to conform. But in some cases, there are certain instances where your emotional response is not completely, how should I say, based in emotion. There's a little bit of logic there, and I don't want to say validated because I don't like using that language, but you can at least empathize with that other person's position without saying they're absolutely crazy, they're out of touch, that they don't necessarily regulate their emotions enough, whatever the talking points about that may be. And the point I'm getting at here is that if you completely throw away the human side of these interactions, the stories that people bring to you that may be a little bit counter to your narrative and have a semblance of humanity, and then they bring their own personal anecdotes to you, and even though they go against your story, you're at least able to hear them out. That shows you have compassion for all human beings, and you're not putting the message, the movement, above the people that are helping you push it forward. And that is how you end up eating your own. If you do not do that, if you do not actually care about the people in the movement, and you say only the end goal is worth sacrificing for, and we cannot have anything that keeps us off message, then you end up eating your own. Because guess what? Maybe there are other people in your movement who also had a bad experience with homelessness, and because you're not willing to hear them out and understand and empathize with their situation and at least take it in, but rather you jump directly to criticism and blasting them and being angry at them for not being ideologically or 100% pure in their ideology, you're going to lose them. You're going to get them kicked out of the movement. They're not going to want to work with you anymore. And you may not be able to salvage that person, and they may actually end up going to the other side. Now, has Anna Kasparian fully left the Democratic Party? No, not necessarily. While she may not be a big fan of the Democratic Party, she is still aligned on some policy issues. She is definitely a person who does not enjoy the woke cancel / woke backlash culture, and that's what I would describe it as. But this is a movement that is apt and is basically, how should I say, prepped to feed on itself. They are primed in order to eat their own, and if they're not careful, it will continue to happen. That's why we've seen a lot of progressives and moderate Democrats especially, leave the Democratic Party. And you can honestly see the same thing on the conservative side of the aisle, where if you don't believe in certain things, if you do not pass a pure ideology or ideological test, then you are ostracized from the Republican Party. Both parties are actually going through it, and it is a fascinating phenomenon to watch. But, we can cover that on another day. I think this article is just emblematic of it. And if you want to read a little bit more about Anna Kasparian, her journey, and where she still aligns with her party and where she has a little bit of pushback, go read that article. It will be linked in the description below that like and subscribe button. All right, so now we go to our final article from Daily Kosк. Doug Emhoff has a very strong theory about Trump's debate dodging. Now, Mr. Emhoff, I don't necessarily know if we watched the same debate, but let's hear what he has to say here. Quote, well, you saw the first debate, didn't you? Emhoff replied to MSNBC host Joe Scarborough, who responded that he had. Quote, yeah, that's why he got his blank kicked, Emhoff said. Quote, and so he's afraid that that's going to happen again. And rather, he's spreading this fog of misinformation and disinformation and gaslighting rather than face her again so we can see the split screen, end quote. Now, do I think that Kamala won that debate? Yes. Do I think it was probably a 55-45 win? Yes. Do I think that it was such a trouncing and absolute beating that Donald Trump doesn't want to get up on that stage because he's afraid that she's going to absolutely destroy him? No, I think there are multiple political implications here. I think, one, he doesn't want to give her more time to contrast herself against him. That doesn't mean that she has to necessarily win, but she just has to play the anti-Trump thing, and it's easier to do and cast herself as that when she's directly across the stage from him. And obviously, she can go out there and message about it all she wants, but it's very different when you see her taking him on head-to-head. And even if she doesn't win, even if she comes out with a 55-45 loss, that still shows she's able to go up against him and at least hold her own to some degree. And unless he has an absolute trouncing where he absolutely destroys her, it actually is almost always going to benefit her because it also allows her to play the presidential role and show that she's up there and she is actually able to handle being in a general election. And I think, honestly, she's lost a little bit of her momentum, a little bit of the love for Kamala is starting to fade. Does that mean that I think she is inherently going to lose? No, I think it's still going to be an extremely close election. And I still think if she's able, it is her election to mess up, and therefore she still has the opportunity to re-huddle and make sure that certain segments of the population fall in behind her. She has to make an appeal to men. That one is going to be extremely hard, especially because most of her first talking points were about reproductive health, and her first talking points were going out there and saying the freedom to choose. And while I don't necessarily think that men are sitting back and saying, oh, I'm not going to vote for her because her pro-choice stance. I'm not saying a lot of men are pro-life, but when that is the quintessential focus of the first few months of your campaign, you are defining your campaign from women's issues. And don't get me wrong, men are involved in the process totally. Otherwise, we could just say, well, okay, it's a woman's issue. The man doesn't have to pay anything. Of course, the father and the men are involved in that decision-making, that process as well, but it is coded as a woman's issue nowadays, and that doesn't necessarily help you. Now, there are other issues like housing that affect absolutely everybody, talking about an opportunity economy. Whether you like what she's saying or not, she's at least trying to use language that can appeal to everybody, but she has to make a stronger appeal towards the men. And I think Donald Trump, honestly, sitting back is saying, I don't have to prove anything anymore. I think that there is a little bit of him that doesn't want to possibly lose on that debate stage, but also I think he realizes there are more benefits in it for Kamala because, once again, showing she's strong, she's willing to go up against him, she's willing to fight him on the stage, she can do the whole prosecutor act, all that sort of stuff. But also, there's part of him that realizes her being out there enough will peel off certain people, and it has. The buzz will slow down. And also, him just playing his game of going out and doing his rallies and attacking them from afar and not having to be on the stage and not have to trounce them and try to be on top of them the entire time like he tried to do with Hillary Clinton in 2016. I think he's learned that little bit of moderation, that little bit of reserved Trump, even though he says some crazy things at his rallies, the media doesn't cover it like they did in 2016 because they realize that's actually a bad thing for him. I think it's actually working out better for him now because they don't want to give him that extra attention, and it allows him to keep this mystique of being a little bit more moderate, a little bit less crazy Trump than he has been in the past. But then again, I could be wrong about all the calculations here. Chris LaScavita could listen to this and be like, no, this kid is absolutely wrong. He has no idea what he's talking about. But I think Doug Emhoff is obviously he's out there advocating for his wife. He's advocating for his vice president, his hopeful presidential pick, because he wants to be the first man. So fair enough. He's obviously got to trounce it up. He's got to play it up a little bit. But I think he's off when he says that he's afraid, Donald Trump is afraid that Kamala would just whoop his butt, because I don't necessarily see that in Trump's actions. He did run away scared from some things, but he stepped up in certain ways as well. So, but then again, like I said, I could very well be wrong. And if you think I'm wrong, throw it down in the comment section. I'd love to hear what your opinions are. But that's enough with all of those stories. Let's actually jump into our daily delight so we can leave you with a little bit of a smile on your face. And this one comes from Parade Pets. Mini donkey, cute little dance is totally making people's day. And yeah, it is a little bit of a cute one. Quote, when life gets you down, a little music can soothe the soul. A mini donkey named Luna agrees, and she's showing the world the way a sweet tune makes her feel with the cutest little dance. And it is a cute little dance. You want to go check? I would say go check out the video. I don't necessarily like TikTok. I understand, but if you want to check out the video on TikTok, maybe it's on Instagram as well. The link to the original video on TikTok in this article will be in the link in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, as well as the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip, where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. And if you want to hear international news, come back tomorrow at 12 noon. And that is when we will have 6 and 6 stories from around the world in 6 minutes or less. So, with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.